People demand freedom of speech as a compensation for the freedom of thought which they seldom use. Soren Kierkegaard. What happens when you finally start thinking for yourself, not repeating, not reacting, not performing intelligence, but actually thinking? Slowly, painfully, without applause. The kind of thinking that strips you down before it lifts you up. The kind that doesn't ask for permission or validation. That is the kind of thought that becomes dangerous. Not because it harms others, but because it refuses to be domesticated. Deep thought makes you dangerous to systems that rely on your passivity. It makes you hard to sell to, harder to manipulate, and nearly impossible to impress. You stop chasing empty labels. You stop needing to be loud. You become harder to offend, yet easier to shake awake by truth. Schopenhauer warned that most people will avoid the discomfort of thinking their own thoughts for as long as possible. It is easier to belong than to wake up, easier to mimic than to question. But if you want to think deeply, you must be willing to risk being misunderstood. You must become your own source of clarity, even when nothing makes sense. Kierkegaard believed truth was not something you inherit. It is something you suffer for, something you wrestle with in silence. And when you arrive at even a small piece of it, you change. Not outwardly first, but inwardly. The way you move through the world shifts, not with arrogance, but with quiet gravity. So think, not to impress, not to win, but to wake up. Because the real danger is not being wrong. The real danger is never thinking deeply enough to know what you truly believe. Let's dive in deeper. Number 1. You must learn to sit with contradiction without needing quick resolution. Most people want fast answers, clear labels, neat categories. We're trained from early on to believe that every question has a correct answer and that confusion is a problem to fix, not a place to learn. But if you want to think deeply, if you want to reach the kind of truth that actually shifts your understanding of the world, you need to do something most people never do. Learn to sit with contradiction without rushing to solve it. Contradictions are everywhere. You can love someone and still know they are bad for you. You can feel joy and grief in the same moment. You can believe in free will and still see how much of life is outside your control. The deeper you think, the more paradox you uncover. And shallow minds panic when they meet this complexity. They force themselves into either-or thinking just to feel safe. But deep thinkers, the ones who actually change things, they pause. They stay inside that tension. Take Soren Kierkegaard, for example. He wrestled with the contradiction of faith and doubt. He believed that faith was not certainty, but a kind of leap that happens right next to despair. He didn't try to explain it away. He stayed there. Arthur Schopenhauer saw the beauty of life while also seeing it as filled with suffering and will-driven chaos. He did not try to sugarcoat it. He let the contradiction live. In daily life, you might feel this when facing moral choices, when you want to speak up but also want peace, when your heart says yes but your logic says no. Most people pick a side quickly just to escape discomfort. But if you want to think deeply, you have to slow down and listen to both sides, even when they disagree. This is where wisdom grows, in the discomfort. True depth comes from letting ideas rub up against each other without rushing to silence one. It comes from knowing that not everything can be solved, and that's not a flaw. That is the nature of reality. If you can sit with contradiction without needing to clean it up, then you're already thinking at a level that most people never reach. And that makes your mind quietly, powerfully dangerous. Number 2. Stop outsourcing your thoughts to group consensus. Most people have no idea that the majority of their thoughts are not actually their own. They think they're being original, but what they're really doing is echoing what they've been told by their parents, their teachers, their favorite influencers, or the loudest voice in the room. It's not thinking, it's downloading. And the scary part is they don't even realize it. We are conditioned to agree. From a young age, we are rewarded for fitting in, for saying the right thing, for holding the safe opinion. You learn to survive by blending in school, in friendships, at work. And slowly, without noticing, your inner voice gets replaced by a collection of recycled thoughts. You end up defending beliefs you never actually chose. Group consensus is a subtle trap. It gives you comfort and belonging, but it quietly steals your ability to think clearly. You start to feel that going against the majority means you are wrong. You confuse popularity with truth, and once that happens, your mind becomes a mirror, not a source. To think deeply, you have to call that out. You have to pause and ask, where did this belief come from? Who benefits if I keep thinking this way? That question alone can start an inner earthquake. Think about how people talk about success, or love, or morality. Much of it is scripted. If you challenge those scripts, people get uncomfortable. That's how you know you're touching something real. Deep thinkers are often seen as rebels or cynics, but they are not trying to be difficult. They are trying to be honest. You do not need to fight every group opinion, but you need to know when it is not yours. The moment you realize how many of your thoughts were planted in you by systems that never cared about your truth, something shifts. You stop playing the game. You stop parroting. You start asking deeper questions. This is where real thinking begins. Not when you agree, but when you pause and say, wait, is that actually true for me? That moment is quiet, but it is revolutionary. And if you do it often enough, your mind stops being a follower. It becomes a force. Number 3, learn how to live without an audience. Most people live as if they're being watched. Even when they're alone, there's an invisible audience in their minds, watching, judging, approving, reacting. Social media made it worse, but this habit started long before the internet. From childhood, we learn to measure our thoughts, words, and choices based on what others might think. That's not thinking, that's performing. To think deeply, you have to break that performance. You have to learn how to live without an audience. That means thinking in a room with no applause, making sense of things without needing anyone to nod or agree, doing your inner work even if no one ever sees the outcome. This is not the same as being lonely. It is a chosen kind of privacy, a psychological solitude where your thoughts are no longer shaped by how they will be received. Most people never reach this space. They are too attached to being liked, to sounding smart, to being approved of. And so their minds stay safe, predictable, and shallow. Real thinking often begins when the noise of other people's expectations fades, when you are no longer curating yourself, when you can sit with an idea without tweeting it, without posting it, without imagining how it will sound at dinner. In that raw silence, your mind begins to grow its own voice, not a borrowed one, not a socially polished one, your real voice. Take writers, philosophers, and deep creatives. The best ones vanish for long stretches. They disappear, not just physically, but mentally. They go into that place where they do not owe anyone a show. That's where the sharpest thinking happens. That's where the insights that cut through nonsense are born. Here's the truth. If your thoughts need to be seen to feel real, then they are not fully yours yet. Learn to think in the dark. Learn to create without applause. Learn to arrive at clarity without needing validation. The more you detach from the imagined crowd in your head, the more dangerous your mind becomes. Because now, you are thinking from truth, not performance, not fear, just truth. And that kind of mind cannot be manipulated. It becomes a force that does not blink. Number 4, think to confront yourself, not to decorate your ego. Most people think just enough to protect their self-image, not to challenge it. They confuse thinking with self-promotion. They want to sound intelligent, look aware, seem evolved. But deep thought is not about seeming anything. It is about becoming someone who can face truth without flinching. And that starts by using your mind to confront yourself, not decorate your ego. True thinking does not flatter. It exposes. It shines a light on your blind spots, your contradictions, your excuses. It forces you to ask uncomfortable questions. Why do I really want what I want? Who am I when no one needs anything from me? What part of me am I hiding behind performance or politeness? These are not questions that make you look good. They make you feel real. And that is the point. When you think only to reinforce the idea that you are right, wise, or awakened, you're not thinking. You're rehearsing. You're polishing a mask. But when you think to shake yourself, to pull apart your assumptions, to drag your pride into the light, something deeper happens. You grow in honesty. You become less reactive. You start catching your own mental games in real time. This is not about shame. It is about courage. The courage to look at your emotional mess and say, there it is. Now what? The courage to say I was wrong, or I'm still confused, or I don't like who I am in this situation. That level of honesty is rare. It is raw, but it is how the false layers collapse. Real clarity often begins as discomfort. It stirs your peace. It shakes up your certainties. But if you stay with it long enough, it clears the fog. You stop needing to look impressive. You just want to be true. And that shift changes everything. So if you are using your mind to build a version of yourself that you think others will admire, pause. That is not deep thinking. That is image management, and the ego loves it. But if you are thinking to challenge your own illusions, to step out of your own shadow, to clean your own lens, then you are on the real path, the hard one, the one that leads to freedom. Number 5. Become intimately familiar with your darkest emotions. Most people want to think clearly, but they don't want to feel deeply, and that's the problem. You cannot think deeply if you are constantly running from your darkest emotions. The mind will only go as deep as the heart is willing to feel. If you avoid envy, despair, rage, or shame, your thoughts will always be filtered, edited, softened. Not by intelligence, but by fear. Deep thought is not just about what you know. It is about what you are willing to face. And facing your own shadow takes a different kind of strength. Not the strength to solve or fix, but the strength to sit with what is raw, heavy, and uncomfortable. Take envy, for example. Most people pretend they don't feel it. They label it toxic or immature and push it aside. But a deep thinker asks, why do I envy this person? What longing in me is unfulfilled? That question leads somewhere. That kind of thought doesn't flatter you, but it frees you. The same goes for despair. If you avoid it, it controls you. But if you look it in the eye, if you let yourself feel it fully without turning away, you find clarity. Despair strips away illusions. It tells you what actually matters. Rage and shame work the same way. They are not pleasant, but they are revealing. Rage shows you what you will no longer tolerate. Shame shows you where your self-worth is leaking. These emotions are not weaknesses. They are doorways. But most people slam those doors shut. They want to stay clean, composed, unaffected. They want to sound wise without getting emotionally messy. That is not depth, that is performance. To think without fear, you have to know your own darkness. You have to recognize when your thoughts are avoiding certain truths just to stay comfortable. And when you stop running from those feelings, when you actually listen to what your darkest emotions are trying to tell you, something powerful happens. Your thoughts become sharp. Your insights go deeper. Your clarity becomes undeniable. Because now your thinking is no longer managed by fear. It is led by truth. And that is what makes a mind truly dangerous. Not how much it knows, but how much it dares to feel. Number 6. Read philosophy not for answers, but for demolition. Most people approach philosophy like it's self-help with fancier words. They want quotes to highlight, lines to repost, a clever sentence to nod at. But real philosophy, the kind written by minds like Kierkegaard and Schopenhauer, is not meant to decorate your day. It is meant to disturb your certainty. It is meant to undo you. If you are reading philosophy just to feel inspired or wise, you are missing the point. Deep philosophy does not exist to give you neat answers. It exists to question your answers, to expose the cracks in your thinking, to make you doubt what you thought was solid. It is demolition, not decoration. Kierkegaard doesn't give you comfort, he gives you tension. He writes about despair not to fix it, but to show how close it sits to faith. He forces you to think about your inner contradictions and how most of your choices are based on avoidance rather than truth. That is not light reading, that is soul excavation. Schopenhauer is even more brutal. He tells you plainly that life is full of suffering and that most human desire is driven by blind will, not reason. He doesn't tell you how to be happy. He tells you how illusion works. And in that process, something strange happens. You get closer to freedom. Not because he hands it to you, but because he clears away the lies you thought were freedom. When you read philosophy only for pretty insights, you remain on the surface. You might sound intelligent, but your inner world stays untouched. Real philosophy is supposed to pull you down into discomfort. It is supposed to leave you speechless sometimes. It is supposed to ruin your false peace. So read slowly. Read without trying to agree. Let the ideas cut. Let them embarrass your shallow logic. Let them show you the difference between thinking and parroting. If you read to feel inspired, you will only ever collect words. But if you read to be dismantled, you will eventually meet yourself. Not the self shaped by trends or approval, but the one who thinks in silence and stands alone. That self is rare and very hard to control. Number 7. Understand that language both reveals and hides truth. Language is the most powerful tool you have, and the most dangerous. It lets you name the world, share ideas, build meaning, but it also quietly shapes what you can imagine. It draws invisible borders around your thoughts. You think you are thinking freely, but often you are just moving within the cage your language built. Most people never question the words they use. They assume that if they can describe something, they understand it. But deep thinkers know that words are slippery. They reveal some truth while hiding others. They simplify what is complex. They often reduce living experience into dead categories. Take a word like success. What does it actually mean? For most people, it carries images and feelings they never chose. Money, status, validation. But where did those meanings come from? Culture, family, repetition. If you do not question that word, you chase a life you never consciously defined. The same goes for words like love, good, normal, smart. Each one feels clear until you dig. And once you start digging, you realize how language has already chosen your direction before you even began to think. That is how it hides truth. It decides your framework for you. Kierkegaard understood this. He used language precisely but also playfully, exposing how religious and ethical words were often misused to avoid truth, not find it. Schopenhauer treated language like a scalpel. He cut away illusions with careful, exact phrasing, but he also warned how easily language could distort reality if used carelessly. To think deeply, you have to become suspicious of your own vocabulary. You have to ask, what do I really mean by this word? You have to notice when a phrase is covering up ignorance, or when it is protecting your ego, or when it is simply repeating what others say. Sometimes the most honest thing you can say is, I don't have the right word for this yet. That humility opens space for real thought. It gives you room to feel something without rushing to label it. And in that space, depth lives. Words are tools, but they are not truth itself. They are maps, not the territory. Use them carefully, sharpen them, but never mistake them for the thing they describe. The deeper you think, the more respect you develop for silence. Because that is where thought escapes the trap of language and becomes real. Number 8. Do not confuse opinions with original thought. Most of what people call thinking is just reacting. It is memorized opinion wrapped in confidence. It sounds sharp, it feels right, and it fits neatly into a tweet or a conversation. But it is not original thought. It is repetition wearing a clever disguise. Real thought is rare because it is difficult. It does not arrive fully formed or in a slogan. It takes silence. It takes confusion. It often starts with, I don't know yet. That's not weakness. That's the beginning of clarity. Look at the way people argue. One person throws out a viewpoint. The other counters with something they heard from a podcast, a parent, a political thread, back and forth, predictable. Nothing new is born. These are not thinkers. They are soundboards echoing whatever side they've chosen to attach to. And often they don't even know where those ideas came from. To think originally, you have to slow down. You have to pause before you speak and ask yourself, where did this belief come from? Is it based on experience? Or am I just repeating what sounds smart? That pause is everything. Kierkegaard refused to adopt the loud philosophies of his time without dissecting them. He didn't care about fitting in with the intellectual trends. He wanted to go deeper than agreement or disagreement. Schopenhauer, too, didn't just parrot the optimism of others. He challenged it at its root and redefined the human experience through a darker, more honest lens. Neither of them was interested in sounding right. They wanted to see clearly. If your thoughts can fit easily on a bumper sticker, be careful. That's a sign they might not be your own. Truth is rarely that tidy. It resists slogans. It disrupts categories. It demands your full attention. So next time you find yourself in a debate, try this. Say less. Think longer. Ask yourself if what you're about to say is just a rerun of someone else's mind. If it is, sit with it longer. Let it burn through the noise. Let something fresh emerge. Because original thought does not shout. It arrives slowly. It is not reactive. It is earned. And once you start thinking that way, you won't just speak differently. You'll see differently. That's when the mind becomes something worth listening to. Number 9. Challenge the assumptions of your emotional reactions. Most people trust their emotional reactions without question. If they feel offended, they must have been wronged. If they feel jealous, someone else must have something they deserve. If they feel ashamed, they must have done something bad. The feeling shows up, and they believe it immediately. No investigation, no pause, just reaction. But deep thinkers know that emotions are not always messengers of truth. Sometimes they are echoes of old conditioning. Sometimes they are hand-me-down responses passed on by culture, family, or trauma. Feeling something strongly does not make it accurate. It just means it hit something deep. And what it hit might not be real. Let's say someone ignores your text. You instantly feel disrespected or rejected. A shallow mind stops there. A deeper mind asks, why does this trigger me? Who taught me to attach my worth to someone else's attention? Is this about them or something in me that is still unresolved? Or take anger. Most people assume their anger is righteous. But what if it is a cover for fear? What if it is rooted in an identity that feels threatened? What if it is protecting a story you've never questioned? That kind of reflection breaks the cycle. It takes courage to ask, what if my feelings are built on assumptions that are not even mine? Kierkegaard understood that many of our reactions are shaped by despair, not conscious, loud despair, but the kind that hides beneath our roles and expectations. Schopenhauer believed that much of our suffering comes from mistaken desires and illusions we never examine. Both of them point to the same truth. Unexamined emotion can keep us locked in small lives. Deep thinking begins when you stop worshiping your feelings and start studying them. When you ask, where did this reaction come from? Who taught me that this kind of situation requires this kind of emotion? You realize how many of your feelings are not actually yours. They are rehearsed, inherited, automatic. That realization doesn't make your emotions less valid. It just makes them more visible. And once they are visible, you have a choice. You can react the same old way, or you can pause, reflect, and respond from a deeper place. That pause is where freedom lives. That pause is where thought begins. Number 10. Kill the idea that you must always be optimistic. You do not need to be optimistic all the time. In fact, the obsession with constant positivity is one of the things that keeps people shallow. It forces you to dress your pain in smiles, to deny your darkness, and to call every collapse a blessing in disguise. But real depth begins when you stop needing every truth to comfort you. Some truths are ugly. Some things you lose do not come back. Some seasons of life do not carry meaning until much later, if ever. And that is not pessimism. That is honesty. Deep thinkers do not run from these facts. They sit with them. They let sorrow teach. They let silence stretch. You will not find clarity if you insist on always feeling good. Sometimes clarity comes through breakdown. Sometimes you see the most clearly when something inside you shatters and you realize the pieces were never meant to stay together. Optimism would rush to fix it. Depth lets it fall. Kierkegaard understood that despair was not something to avoid, but something to explore. He saw it as a doorway into the self, a confrontation with the parts of you that can no longer fake it. Schopenhauer took it even further. He stripped away illusions and faced the harshness of life head-on. He believed that suffering is built into the structure of human existence, not because he wanted to be miserable, but because he wanted to see without distortion. We live in a culture that equates positivity with intelligence, as if being hopeful is the same as being wise. But wisdom has nothing to do with constant optimism. It has everything to do with reality, even when that reality is painful or heavy or hopeless for a while. If you allow yourself to stop performing happiness, you may finally feel something real. You may notice things others rush past. you may uncover a deeper peace, not the fragile peace of pretending everything will be fine, but the grounded peace of knowing that you can face the truth, whatever it is. There is strength in joy, yes, but there is also power in sorrow. Do not skip one in pursuit of the other. The deepest thinkers have walked through both and come out quieter, clearer, and more alive, not because they always hoped, but because they finally saw. Number 11. Learn how to delay understanding. In a world that rewards speed, the idea of slowing down your understanding feels almost unnatural. We are used to quick answers, instant reactions, fast takes. If we do not get it immediately, we assume it is not worth our time, or worse, that we are not smart enough. But deep thought does not work like that. It is not fast food, it is fermentation. Some ideas are not meant to be grasped the first time, or the second, or even the 10th. They linger, they whisper. They show up years later in moments of silence or suffering and suddenly make sense. Not because the idea changed, but because you did. Quick insight is tempting. It feels satisfying, like solving a puzzle or finishing a book. But many times it is shallow. It gives you the illusion of understanding while skipping the internal transformation that real thought requires. You do not need to rush toward insight. You need to sit with it. Think of how certain quotes stay with you. At first they sound nice, poetic even, but they don't hit you. Then, months or years later, they land, fully, deeply, without warning. That is not just remembering, that is delayed understanding. It is your inner life catching up to the depth of the thought. Kierkegaard often wrote in layers. Some of his most powerful ideas only reveal themselves after wrestling with them, not reading them. Schopenhauer's work might feel bleak at first, but the more life you live, the more you see how clearly he was pointing to truths others avoid. These thinkers were not writing to be quickly understood. They were writing to plant seeds. The problem is not that people are incapable of deep thought. The problem is they do not give thought time. They demand clarity before they have earned it. But wisdom comes slowly. It unfolds. It deepens as you do. So give yourself permission to not understand right away. Let the idea sit in your body. Let it live with your questions. Let it grow silently in the background while you move through life. Understanding that lasts is not rushed, it is not loud, it is not forced, it matures over time, just like you. Number 12. See thinking as an act of resistance. Thinking, real thinking, is one of the most underrated forms of rebellion. In a world that wants you reactive, distracted, and predictable, slowing down to actually consider something is a disruption. It is not just a mental habit, it is a refusal. Most people do not realize how much of modern life is designed to keep you from thinking. You scroll, you click, you consume. Information flies at you faster than you can process it. The goal is not to help you understand. The goal is to keep you occupied. To think deeply in that environment is like trying to hear a whisper in the middle of a stadium. You have to tune out the noise. You have to choose silence when everything around you wants your attention. But when you do, something dangerous starts to happen. You begin to question. You begin to notice what does not add up. You begin to see through performances and patterns. And the moment you do that, you become less controllable. You stop being easy to sell to, easy to influence, easy to predict. That is why deep thought feels uncomfortable. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because you are stepping out of line. Kierkegaard thought of truth as something you had to suffer for. It was not something handed to you by institutions or inherited from your parents. It was something earned through inward struggle and uncomfortable honesty. Schopenhauer believed that most of society was built on illusions people were too afraid to challenge. To think clearly for them was to see through all of it, and that kind of clarity is not always welcomed. This is why deep thinking can feel lonely. It can make you seem strange. It can pull you away from popular conversations and surface-level engagement. But that solitude is not weakness. It is the cost of seeing clearly. To think for yourself in a culture that feeds you ready-made beliefs is to live awake in a world of sleepwalkers. It is a radical act. Not flashy, not loud, but powerful. The world will try to rush you, distract you, shape your mind for you. Let it try. You can resist simply by thinking, slowly, bravely, and completely. In final words, People demand freedom of speech as a compensation for the freedom of thought which they seldom use. Soren Kierkegaard. What happens when you finally start thinking for yourself? Not repeating, not reacting, not performing intelligence, but actually thinking, slowly, painfully, without applause. The kind of thinking that strips you down before it lifts you up. The kind that doesn't ask for permission or validation. That is the kind of thought that becomes dangerous. Not because it harms others, but because it refuses to be domesticated. Deep thought makes you dangerous to systems that rely on your passivity. It makes you hard to sell to, harder to manipulate, and nearly impossible to impress. You stop chasing empty labels. You stop needing to be loud. You become harder to offend, yet easier to shake awake by truth. Schopenhauer warned that most people will avoid the discomfort of thinking their own thoughts for as long as possible. It is easier to belong than to wake up. Easier to mimic than to question. But if you want to think deeply, you must be willing to risk being misunderstood. You must become your own source of clarity, even when nothing makes sense. Kierkegaard believed truth was not something you inherit. It is something you suffer for, something you wrestle with in silence. And when you arrive at even a small piece of it, you change. Not outwardly first, but inwardly. The way you move through the world shifts, not with arrogance, but with quiet gravity. So think, not to impress, not to win, but to wake up, because the real danger is not being wrong. The real danger is never thinking deeply enough to know what you truly believe. Thank you for watching, and see you in another episode.